Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this discourse, which is the discourse on not self, the characteristic, part 2. And before I commence with the talk proper, let me do a very short puja. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. As announced by the, Brother Terence earlier, this particular talk is interesting in the sense that like this particular picture series of icons indicate there are so many versions of ourselves in the course of a day, in the course of the week, on the month, in the years. But the question is, which one is us, if there is any one? So this is a question which the sutta, the Buddha delivered, will try to answer. And the scene of the Ānanda Fong, just to recap, is when the Buddha journeyed from Buddha Gaya to Isipatana, the deer park, to seek out the 5 ascetics. And upon arrival, the Buddha shared with the 5 ascetics the Panchavaggiya, the first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. And at the end of it, Venerable Kondanya attained the first stage of sainthood, Sotapan. And soon after that, the Buddha proceeded to share the Ānanda Sutta, the sutta on the not self characteristic. So this to recap the sutta portion. At the bottom, the Buddha started by saying, monks, form is not self. And mendicants, form is not self. For if form was self, it wouldn't lead to affliction, and you could compel form. That means you can wish that your form, may my form be like this, may I not be like this. But because form is not self, it leads to affliction, to suffering, and you can't compel form. That may my form be like this, may it not be like this. So obviously we have no control over our form. And similarly, the Buddha went through the rest, including feeling is not self, perception is not self, choices or determinations are not self, consciousness is not self. And the Buddha continued with this iteration, is form permanent or impermanent? And the venerables, the 5 venerables mentioned impermanence. But if it's impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? Suffering, sir, the 5 replied. But if it's impermanent, suffering, and perishable, is it fit to be regarded thus? This is mine, I am this is myself. And the 5 replied, no, sir. And in part 1, we went through some elaborate analysis as to form. That form, the characteristic of, or the nature of us, is that we are anicca, we are dukkha, and we are anatta. We are impermanent. There is unsatisfactoriness, and there is that we are not self. And in the analysis of form, we note that we are made up of organs. For those in the medical profession, and for the rest of us who still remember what we have studied in school, we would be familiar with this particular diagram on the bottom left, that we are made up of parts. In this case, the various organs that function to keep us alive. And all these organs themselves, when you go down to the elements, the smallest functioning portion, which is typically the cell itself is made up of parts. There are organelles inside them that do their function. And within these cells, there are molecules. And the picture shows here the hemoglobin, which we are all too familiar. And hemoglobin at the center of this organometallic compound, there is iron that gives it the characteristic red in color. That is our blood. And of course, the hemoglobin, most of us will remember, serves a very important function in carrying oxygen from the lungs over to the various cells all over the body. So we are made of parts, and even this hemoglobin, they themselves are made of atoms, different elements, and the atoms themselves are made up of parts. So life is an ever series of processes in flux, dependent on conditions. Everything is moving. Nothing is static. Even in death, it is still moving. Not that we are alive, but the process of decay. It is still a process. Even decay itself is a process. Growth is a process. So life itself is a series of many, many processes, all dependent on conditions to keep it moving. Now, just a recap. In the 𝘿𝙖𝙢𝙖𝙎𝙝𙖖 Sutta, this 𝓤𝓾𝓷𝓭𝓪, the Nicanta son, was dwelling in 𝘿𝙗𝙖 and a professional debater, and he was adamant in trying to debate with the Buddha on the aspects of self, and he boasted to the inhabitants of 𝘿𝙗𝙖 that he could squash and make the Buddha sweat with respect to the debate. So that was his setup of that, and a large group of the Vajjayans, the crowd went to see the Buddha. In the ensuing discussions and the debate, this occurred because the Buddha, this debate involved 𝘖𝙢𝙖𝙢 throwing some questions to the Buddha, which the Buddha was able to answer, and the Buddha throwing questions back to 𝘖𝙢𝙢. And they came to a point whereby 𝘖𝙢𝙢 had difficulty answering. And this particular painting, which we see in many, many temples, versions of this painting, the Blessed One saw the spirit as did 𝘖𝙢𝙢, because the spirit was poised to what they call harm 𝘖𝙢𝙢, because he refused to answer, or rather he was afraid to answer, lest he admitted defeat. So when the 𝘖𝙢𝙢 saw this spirit above him, ready to strike him, which the Buddha and 𝘖𝙢𝙢 could see, he turned round to the Buddha and said, "Let Master Gotama ask me, and I will answer." So the Buddha asked, "What do you think when you say feeling is myself, perception is myself, fabrications are myself, consciousness is myself? Do you will power over that consciousness? May my consciousness be thus. May my consciousness not be thus." So this was the question posed by the Buddha. And 𝘖𝙢𝙢 replied, "No, Master Gotama." And the Buddha responded, "Pay attention and answer only after having paid attention. What you said after isn't consistent with what you said before, nor is what you said before consistent with what you said after." That was, they was referring to the initial position of 𝘖𝙢𝙢 with respect to the aspect of being one with your consciousness and so on. So the Buddha continued, "What do you think? Is form constant or unchanging, or inconstant or impermanent?" And 𝘖𝙢𝙢 replied, "Impermanent, Master Gotama." "And is that which is impermanent easeful or stressful?" So stressful, dukkha. So and it is fitting to regard what is it fitting to regard what is impermanent, stressful, subject to change as this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? And 𝘖𝙢𝙢 replied, "No, Master Gotama." So, and the Buddha went through the various iterations. Is feeling constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Master Gotama, 𝘖𝙢𝙢 replied. Is perception constant or impermanent? Impermanent, Master Gotama. Is fabrications constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Master Gotama. So what do you think? Is consciousness constant or impermanent? Impermanent, Master Gotama. And is what is impermanent easeful or stressful? Stressful, Master Gotama, 𝘖𝙢𝙢 replied. So, and it's fitting to regard what is impermanent, stressful, Is it fitting to regard what is impermanent, stressful, subject to change as this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? And Satyaka replied, no, Master Gautama. So what do you think? When one adheres to stress, holds to stress, is attached to stress, and envisions of stress, that this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am, would he comprehend stress or dwell having destroyed stress? And Satyaka replied, how could that be, Master Gautama? No. So that being the case, don't you adhere to stress, hold to stress? Aren't you attached to stress? And don't you envision of stress that this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? And Satyaka replied, how could that not be the case, Master Gautama? Yes, Master Gautama. Now, Master Gautama, to what extent is the disciple of Master Gautama one who carries out his message, carries out his instruction, one who has crossed beyond and over doubt, one with no more questioning, one who has gained fearlessness and dwells independent of others with regard to the teacher's message? This was the question posed by Satyaka to the Buddha. And the Buddha replied, there is the case where a disciple of mine sees with right discernment any form whatsoever, past, future, or present, internal or external, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near. Every form has come to be as this is not mine, this is not myself, this is not why I am. He sees with right discernment any feeling, any perception, any fabrications, any consciousness whatsoever, past, future, or present, internal or external, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near. Every consciousness as it's come to be as this is not mine, this is not myself, this is not what I am. It is to this extent that the disciple of mine is one who carries out my message, carries out my instruction, one who has crossed over and beyond doubt, one with no more questioning, one who has gained fearlessness and dwells independent of others with regard to the teacher's message. And to what extent Master Gautama is among an Arhat, one whose mental influence are ended, who has reached fulfillment, done the task, laid down the burden, attained the true goal, laid to waste the fetter of becoming, and is released through right noxus. And the Buddha replied, there is a case where a monk, having seen with right discernment any form whatsoever, past, future, or present, internal, external, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near, every form as it has come to be, as this is not mine, this is not myself, this is not what I am, is through the lack of clinging, sustenance, released. Having seen with right discernment any feeling, any perception, any fabrications, any consciousness whatsoever, and so on, as this is not mine, this is not myself, this is not who I am, he is through the lack of clinging, released. It is to this extent that a monk is an Arahat, one whose mental influence are ended, who has reached fulfillment, done the task, laid down the burden, attained the true goal, laid to waste the fetter of becoming, and is released through right noxus. So one thus released is endowed with three unsurpassables: the unsurpassable vision, unsurpassable practice, unsurpassable release. And the monk whose mind is thus released still honors, respects, reveres, and worships the Tathagata in this way. The awakened, the Blessed One, reaches the Dhamma for awakening. Tamed, the Blessed One, teaches the Dhamma for taming. Tranquil, the Blessed One, teaches the Dhamma for tranquility. Having crossed over, the Blessed One teaches the Dhamma for crossing over. Totally unbound, the Blessed One teaches the Dhamma for total unbinding. And so we revisit this issue of the characteristics of existence. That existence is anicca, it is dukkha, it is anatta. And we have seen this in the previous part 1, that life goes through. We are born. If we are fortunate enough to live to childhood, we grow up to youth, we might meet our significant other, we grow old together, and one by one, we will pass away. This is the transiency of life. And seeing in life, anicca, dukkha, anatta, we see that life transitions from childhood to youth to old age. And moving from left to right, within childhood, there are a lot of changes, a lot of anicca, a lot of dukkha also, not getting what you want, and all rooted in anatta. And from top to bottom, we have the changes in life as we grow up from childhood to youth to old age, and finally passing away. So right through life, within our life and across time, there are a lot of changes, a lot of dukkha. And we see it all around us. We see it within us that there is old age, there is sickness, and there is death, all of which we cannot control. So the pictures here show on the left, growing old, and towards the center portion, we have those who are sick. We also have visions of mental suffering, of remorse, of worry, of hurt, and so on. And ultimately, there is death. Now, all these aspects of anatta are linked intrinsically with the Buddha's deep teachings on the 12 links of dependent origination, paticca samuppada, which starts with ignorance, avidya, moving on to sankhara, formations, moving on to consciousness, vijnana, then nama rupa, mentality and materiality, going on to sense, 6 sense bases, salayatana, and moving on to contact, then to feeling, craving, clinging, habitual tendencies, and birth. And with birth, there's always aging, death, pain, grief, and despair. But with respect to anatta, that we can see very clearly, we like to highlight certain aspects. That because there is consciousness, there is nama rupa, mentality, materiality. And with that, with the developing fetus in the mother's womb, there is the development of the 6 sense bases. Most of us will know it as our sense organs. 5 sense organs, with the 6 being the mind. As long as you have sense organs, the organs do what? They detect phenomena. So the detection is called contact, passer. And with contact, it is up to us, our defilements or our wisdom, to react accordingly. So we have feelings that arise out of that contact. We might push it away, or we might pull it towards us. Pull it towards us being craving. Pushing away, there is hatred involved, there's dislike. And with this aspect of reaction to feeling, as I mentioned, there is craving and pushing away, and then solidification in the sense of clinging. Through these stages, we generate karmic energies which affect us. And with repeated reaction by craving and clinging, we create habitual tendencies, which prepares the groundwork for our future becoming. It means rebirth and so on. And this happens. Now, in the Khanda Sutta from the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter number 22, Sutta number 48, the Buddha analyzes attempts to answer the question, what are we? And some philosophies will say, oh, we are body and soul. But in Buddhism, many books, Dhamma books, normally refer to us as nama rupa. Nama means the mind, and rupa being the form, the body. But this nama rupa, the term nama rupa, can be broken up into finer details, meaning the 5 aggregates. 𝑘𝓷𝓷𝓷. Now, the key word is aggregates. Now, aggregates meaning they are headlines for groups. So they are in themselves not physical in one entity, but they are just a title, a classification of a group of phenomena, which can be subdivided further. So the 5 groupings or 5 aggregates are, the Buddha says, whatever form is past, future, or present, internal or external, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near. This is called the form aggregate, 𝓤𝓾𝓷𝓭𝓪. And the balance are made up of nama, the mind. So the mind is made up of the feeling aggregate, 𝓤𝓷𝓲𝓪, made up of perception aggregate, 𝑠aññā-khandha, made up also of fabrications aggregate or 𝓟𝓾𝓷𝓭𝓪, and made up of consciousness aggregate, the 𝑣ijñāna-khandha. So all these 5 aggregates are called the 𝑝añcakhandha. That makes up us. This is what we are made up of. Again, I like to emphasize, the form aggregate is not just form, but form a group of forms. They make up this form, come under this grouping called form. So there are different kinds of feelings coming under the feeling aggregate that make up this feeling. Perception, there are groups of feeling or perceptions. Fabrications also, and different kinds of consciousness. They come under the consciousness aggregate. Now, going deeper a little bit, Cakkhu, meaning the eye. Now, here the sutta from the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter number 25, sutta number 1, at Savatthi, the Buddha taught, monks, the eye is impermanent, perishing, and changing. Now, impermanent, the physical eye itself is impermanent. It develops, it exists, is changing, and it perishes, it declines in the ability to function. So impermanent, perishing, and changing. And not only that, the other sense organs, the ear also is impermanent, perishing, and changing. Nose, the tongue, the body, and finally the mind. The mind itself is also impermanent, perishing, and changing. So all these are with respect to sense organs. So all of our 5 senses plus our mind, which is number 6, are impermanent, perishing, and changing. What about form? Rupa Sutta. Here, the Buddha talks about sights. So we use our eyes to see. So what we see, the sights itself, is impermanent, perishing, and changing. And similarly, the sounds too are impermanent, perishing, and changing. And it goes down the list of the 𝑝añcakhandha, the smells, the tastes, the touches, and the thoughts via the mind. So the organ of sense itself is impermanent, perishing, and changing. And what it detects, the sense organ that detects all this, the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and the thoughts, also themselves are impermanent, perishing, and changing. And we can attest to that because by merely being mindful of our experience. Saññā. Saññā is perception. So the Buddha says, monks, perception of sights is impermanent, perishing, and changing. Similarly, perception of sounds, perception of smells, perception of taste, perception of touches, perception of thoughts, all of which are impermanent, perishing, and changing. Vijnana. Vijnana is consciousness. So monks, I consciousness is impermanent, perishing, and changing. Now, with reference to the particular diagram, how does the I consciousness arise? Well, it comes from the fact that there is an actual image, an object, in this case, a tree on the left-hand side of this picture. Light falls on this tree, and the image of the tree is received by our eye. Now, this actual image, as labeled in this particular diagram, is often in a Buddhist text called the sense objects, objects which are external to us. The eye is the sense base, And what our retina sees is actually an upside down image of the tree. But through the optical nerve, a functioning optical nerve, it goes to the brain. The brain transforms into what we so the action of seeing requires that we have an image or an external sense object, a functioning sense base, which is the eye in this case, and then with this contact coming together of the external object, the sense base, there arises the sense perception and the eye consciousness, which is what we see. So consciousness itself is impermanent, perishing, and changing because we keep on seeing different images, and even the ability of the eye to see properly also is one, and our ability of our brain to interpret accordingly also changes. So our consciousness changes. So eye consciousness changes, ear consciousness changes, nose consciousness changes, tongue consciousness changes, body consciousness changes, and of course, the mind consciousness itself are all impermanent, perishing, and changing. Now, with this arising of consciousness, we react to it. We have Vedana or feeling. So the Buddha says in this sutta, with respect to the 5 senses, then plus the mind, which is number 6, we have feeling born of eye contact. As I mentioned earlier, eye contact is the external image with a sense base, in this case, the eye, and which gives rise to consciousness. So feeling arises out of this contact, eye contact itself. The feeling itself is impermanent, perishing, and changing. Feeling born of ear contact is impermanent, perishing, and changing. Similarly, for feeling born of nose contact, feeling born of tongue contact, feeling born of body contact, feeling born of mind contact, all of which are impermanent, perishing, and changing. Sometimes in this list, it seems to be what they call a textbook type of narration, but we can do experiments. Afterwards, when you are going for your lunch, when you put a spoonful of food into your mouth, you may experience tongue contact, taste contact, and because of that, feeling arises based on the contact. Depending what you eat, the sensation from your tongue contact will change, and it only lasts for a very short while. That itself is evidence of change within your tasting, as tasting via your tongue. So because of this change, it is impermanent and it perishes. The taste itself perishes, and with the moving away of the taste, the feeling itself would change. So feeling born of even the tongue contact itself changes as we are going through our lunch afterwards. Now, Datthabala Sutta is an interesting one. We are talking about feelings just now. So what kind of feelings are available? There, the Buddha here describes 3 kinds of feelings. Basically, feelings are divided into pleasant, painful, and neutral feeling. So there are 3 kinds of feelings. And through feelings, our reaction to it, craving arises. So craving for sights itself is impermanent, perishes, and is changing. Why? Because the sights themselves change, and our opinions of it, our flavor of it, our attachment to it changes. So because of that, all this craving itself changes. And similarly for sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and thoughts. Everything that we are experiencing itself is changing. And because of that, craving arises according to what we experience. And since our experience changes, our craving changes. So craving for all coming through our 6 senses are impermanent, perishing, and changing. And a lot of these aspects are related to anicca, change. Now, in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, Digha Nikaya Sutta number 16, towards the ending, when the Buddha was at Kusinara, there was a point in the sutta where the Buddha mentions that at that time, Venerable Ānanda went to the vihara and leaned against the doorpost and wept. And Venerable Ānanda thought, I'm still but a learner. At that time, Venerable Ānanda had only attained the first stage of sainthood. He was a Sotapan. That's why he knew that I am still but a learner and still have to strive for my own perfection. But alas, my master, which is the Buddha, who was so compassionate towards me, is about to pass away. So at that time, the Buddha spoke to the monks, where bhikkhus is Ānanda? And certain monks gave the Buddha the answer as to where he was. So the Buddha requested the monk to, request Venerable Ānanda to come and see the Buddha. So then the Buddha spoke to Venerable Ānanda, saying, enough, Ānanda, do not grieve, do not lament, for have I not taught from the very beginning that with all that is dear and beloved, there must be change, separation, and severance. Of that which is born, come into being, compounded, and subject to decay, how can one say, may it not come to dissolution? There can be no such state of things. So here the Buddha re-emphasizes to Venerable Ānanda that because of change, whatever is born comes into being, and since we are compounded, all are subject to decay. So wishing otherwise is a wrong understanding. Now continue with the Ānanda Lakkhana Sutta. Now we revisit this page again. Is form permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, sir, the 5 monks said. But if it is impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? Suffering, sir. But if it's impermanent, suffering, and perishable, is it fit to be regarded thus? This is mine. I am this. This is myself. No, sir, the 5 monks mentioned. So similarly, is feeling permanent or impermanent? Obviously, it is not permanent. Is perception permanent or impermanent? Are choices permanent or impermanent? Is consciousness permanent or impermanent? So they all are, to all these, the monks mentioned impermanent, sir. But if it's impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? Suffering, sir. So, but if it's impermanent, suffering, and perishable, is it fit to be regarded as this is mine? I am this. This is myself. The 5 monk answers, no, sir. So you should truly see any kind of form at all, past, future, or present, internal or external, coarse or fine, interior, inferior or superior, far or near, all form with right understanding. This is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. And similarly, the Buddha went through all kinds of feeling are also not mine, not this, not myself. And then all kinds of perception, all kinds of choices. And you should truly see any kind of consciousness at all, past, future, or present, and so on, with right understanding that this is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. Seeing this, a learned, noble disciple grows this illusion with form, feeling, perception, choices, and consciousness. So being disillusioned, desire fades away. When desire fades away, they are free. When they are free, they know they are free. So these are describing the stages in which you gain Nibbanic knowledge of Nibbana. So they understand rebirth is ended. Kina Jati. The spiritual journey has been completed. What had to be done has been done. There is no return for any state of existence. This is what the Buddha said. Satisfied, the group of 5 mendicants were happy with what the Buddha said. And while this discourse was being spoken, the minds of the group of 5 mendicants, the Pancavaggiya, were freed from defilements by not grasping. So the sutta ends by declaring that the Pancavaggiya, the 5 ascetics, understood what the Buddha taught, and they are freed from all defilements. They attain arahatship. That's the end of this particular Ānanda Lakkana Sutta. And continuing, there are some misconceptions in the Buddhist community and elsewhere regarding this particular certain suttas or teachings by the Buddha. Here, reading the English, in Dhammapada verse 160, the Buddha mentions, "One truly is the protector of oneself. Who else could the protector be? With oneself fully controlled, one gains a mastery that is hard to gain." So notice the term "one truly," protector of oneself. This implies that there is I. So why did the Buddha use this? And if you go through the Dhammapada and various suttas, you see also this in verse 165. By oneself is evil die. By oneself is one defiled. By oneself is evil left undone. By oneself is one made pure. Purity and impurity depend on oneself. No one can purify another. So these two examples clearly show the Buddha using the aspect of one, the I aspect. But yet in the Ānanda Lakkana Sutta, the Buddha talks about not self. So is there a contradiction in what the Buddha taught? Well, with reference to the Buddha's teaching on selflessness by Venerable 𝘿𝑉𝑚 𝑇h𝑒𝑟𝑎, this German monk who stayed a long time in Sri Lanka. This is an extract from an article. The source from the Buddhist Publication Society is given at the bottom. You can read the whole analysis. Here, the Venerable 𝘿𝑉𝑚 mentions that there are 3 teachings or teachers in the world. The first teacher teaches the existence of an eternal ego entity outlasting death. This is the group of eternalists, typical of the Christian faith and others like it. The second teacher teaches a temporary ego entity which becomes annihilated, okay, or destroyed at death. So this group is called the annihilalists or materialists. And the third teacher teaches neither an eternal nor a temporary ego entity. This is taught by the Buddha. So these are the 3 kinds of teachers or teachings in the world. Now the Buddha teaches that what we call ego, self, soul, personality, etc. are merely conventional terms, not referring to any real independent entity. So this is conventional. When he teaches that there is only to be found this psychophysical process of existence, changing from moment to moment. Without understanding the selflessness of existence, it is not possible to gain a real understanding of the Buddha word. So, and it is not possible without it to realize the goal of emancipation and deliverance of mind proclaimed by the Buddha. This doctrine of selflessness of existence forms the essence of the Buddha's doctrine of emancipation. Thus, with this doctrine of selflessness or anatta, stands and falls the entire Buddhist structure. Indeed, for anyone who wishes to engage in the study of Buddhist scriptures, the best thing would be from the very start to get himself acquainted with the 2 methods in which the Buddha taught the Dhamma to the world. So the Buddha uses 2 methods to teach Dhamma to the world. The first method is the teaching in conventional language. The second method is the teaching in philosophically correct language. The first one relates to conventional truth, vihara satya. The second, to the truth in the ultimate sense, paramattha satya. So thus, whenever the Buddha uses such terms as I, person, living being, in the previous page, the one, oneself, and so on, etc., this is to be understood as conventional speech, and thus not correct in the higher sense with respect to the Paramattha Vachana. Now, it is similar to speaking of the rising and setting of the sun, though we know thoroughly well that this does not correspond to reality. The sun doesn't rise and set, okay, in reality. So thus the Buddha teaches that in the ultimate sense, amongst all these psychological phenomena of existence, there cannot be found any eternal or even temporary ego entity, and hence that all existence of whatever kind is something impersonal or anatta. So in this connection, I would like to emphasize the fact that this fundamental doctrine of selflessness and emptiness is not, as some misinformed Western Buddhists assert, only taught in the Southern School of Buddhism, the Southern School meaning Theravadins, but that even in the so-called Mahayana schools or the Northern schools, it forms a most essential part. Without this teaching of anatta or egolessness, there is no Buddhism. And without having realized the truth of egolessness, no real progress is possible on the path to deliverance. So, in summary, Sabbe Sankhara Anicca, all conditioned things are impermanent. So here Sankhara or fabrications, this translation by Venerable Buddha Rakita translates Sankhara as conditioned things. So since we are made up, we are subject to conditions, all conditioned things are impermanent. Sabbe Sankhara Dukkha. So all conditioned things are unsatisfactory, not what we want, or suffering. And finally, with respect to today's sharing, Sabbe Dhamma Anatta. All things are not self. Notice in the earlier two quotations, they talk about all conditioned things are impermanent and unsatisfactory. But it is last one, all things are not self. So all phenomena, everything around us are not self. There's no permanent, unchanging entity within them. So these are from Dhammapada verses 277 to 279. So in the end, how do we perceive all this? How do we proceed with our practice? And here, the last slide, I'd like to mention the Dhammapadas 183, that Sabba Papasa Akarana, Kusalasa Upasampada, Sachitta Paridapana, Etang Buddhana Sasana, that we should avoid all evil, do good, and purify your mind. This is the teaching of the Buddhas. So this summarizes all the teachings of the Buddhas. This, in this simplistic three-line advice, also guides us in our practice along the path to gain Nibbana. And like to remind all that we are still in the rains retreat, and that the monastics are still observing Vasa. And for your information, Vasa 2022 ends on the 9th of October. And on the 10th of October onwards, for one calendar month, there will be the period, 1 month of Katina observance, the presentation of requisites to the monastics. So closing, Anumodana, benediction, reciting the Pali only. Akasatta ca bummatta deva naga mahitika punyang tang anumoditva cirang rakkantu sasanang cirang rakkantu desanang cirang rakkantu mamparan. Patidana, dedication of merits. Idang vo nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatoyo. Idang vo nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatoyo. Idang vo nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatoyo. Closing veneration. Arahang Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddhang Bhagavantang Abhivademi. Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammang Namasami. Supatipanno Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho Sanghang Namami. Saddhammo Jirang Titatu. May the good doctrine long endure. Sabbe Satta Sukhi Hontu. May all beings be happy. That's the end of this morning sharing. Back to you, Brother Terence.
Thank you very much, Brother Ānanda, for today's sharing. We want to say very sorry for today's technical glitch from the technical team here. So do join us next week again for the talk. So coming up next in December, there will be a meditation retreat on the taming the monkey mind by Bhante Akaliko on the 7 to 12 December 2022, and the registration is now open. Now let's do some dedication of marriage to all beings. Watching. Bye bye for now.